Well, thank you everybody for coming. Very nice of you to turn up. I'd like to give you a talk tonight on the gods of Mansfield and the ancient ritual landscape that we all occupy and live in. Probably most of us don't even realise it's a lot more complicated than we might have thought. So, my name's Mark. I grew up locally. I moved to Rainworth when I was about 2 years old. Grew up in Rainworth until I was about 16, moved to Blidworth, and then finally to Plesley and then to Sutton where I live now. So I've always lived in this local area. And a few years ago I got quite interested in Druidry. Well, to be truthful, it was a lot longer before that. Around 1996 I first started getting interested in these sorts of subjects, but it was only in the last maybe, I don't know, 7 years or so that I've got really interested in it properly and explored it deeply. And as a part of that, a big part of my interest has been about exploring the local landscape and trying to understand, you know, our own ancestry, our own history and our own mythology, and what might actually be available still to this day where we currently live. So it's been quite a complicated journey that's involved a lot of different research across a lot of different subjects. I've investigated our local rivers, our holy wells and springs. I've looked into the past, particularly around our Celtic past, the hill forts and the Iron Age, some of the Neolithic monuments that remain in the area as well. As well as things like old road boundaries, where there might have been important crossroads and trade routes through the area. Place name etymology is an important part of it as well, trying to understand how we arrive at certain place names that we have today and the clues that might give us that, you know, to this particular subject. And of course our own local folk stories and folk history is very important to this as well. There are even some customs and sayings that we use locally to this day that are quite important. So has everybody heard the phrase, or used the phrase, you've got your monk on? Yeah? So that's quite an interesting phrase that we'll touch on in a little while. And of course, one of my bigger interests as well, particularly within Druidry, is solar alignments, and how those solar alignments actually allow these clues to come up and for you to connect some of these dots together and understand the context between some of these locations. Now, when I first started looking into Druidry, I was reading a book by a guy called Philip Cargon, who is the head of the Order of Bards, Fates and Druids. And one of the things that he talked about in that book was how when they first went over to America and started to try and share stories with the Native Americans had this particularly strong feeling that white people were stealing their traditions and their culture. And they specifically said that if you want to share these stories with us, that's absolutely fine. First you must understand your own stories and your own history and your own land. Look for the gods in your own land. And with that context, come back to us and have these discussions. So it's kind of in that spirit that I've looked into this research. So I'd like to take you on a bit of a journey through the landscape that we live in and some of the folk tales that we all know and love, and some of the bits of information we might not know, and see if we can paint a picture of what the gods of this landscape might also look like. So have you got any questions before we start? And I'm particularly interested in, you know, how much you guys already know about the landscape. So, you know, have you read my blog posts, for example? How much information do you already know?
I know my dad's told me a lot, because they lived in Calverton. There's an old Anglo-Saxon village on top of the mound.
Yeah.
There's also some Anglo-Saxon burial mounds still at the bottom. Yeah, Oxton, yeah. Then there's also the Roman fort as well.
Marching camp.
Yes.
Yep.
Also the old Newark Road as well, which goes through.
And what do you know of the name Calverton?
And it's Anglo-Saxon.
Might be.
Well, the reason why I say that for is because of the old church there.
Yep.
It's actually got some old Anglo-Saxon.
A lot of it has.
Yeah, it has, yeah.
What about everybody else? Anybody else got any good knowledge? Sorry? Oh yeah. Yeah, it's not far away as well, yeah.
I know about the Green Man and Sherwood Forest.
Of course,
because I grew up with the Green Man. I've got the statues at home and everything else. Also, I know on the side of Berry Hill, that's the old marketplace. The old stone posts are still there.
Yeah, they used to be the tax collection.
That's right, yeah. And then there's supposed to be a buried Viking ship, isn't there?
Somewhere in Harlow Wood way.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably on the Thieves Wood side. If you look on Google Earth and look down on Harlow Wood, there's quite a clear area that looks like a little mound.
It does.
Interesting, right?
Yeah.
Anyway then, so yeah, there's a little bit of knowledge already, which is very good. Yes, the Hamilton Hill. Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? There's loads of stuff. There's loads of stuff that's just around us and we didn't even realise.
Are you all going to get metal detectors?
You might. I know a few friends that do a lot of metal detecting.
Did it as a kid.
Okay, so I'm going to start in Blidworth. Very close to my own heart, not far away from where I grew up, but a location I visited many times. And this is Blidworth Druidstone, or more accurately, the altar stone. Blidworth's Druidstone is thought to be a conglomerate deposit from the Ice Age. So really what they're saying is it's kind of like a natural concrete block that was created during the compression of all of the ice, and that the ice carried it from where the stones originated, and it eventually got deposited in Blidworth. And that's been the theory for a lot of people, over the years, and it's particularly because of the type of stone it is, because it's what they call a conglomerate stone. It just looks like a big block of concrete. But the truth is, it's actually part of a much wider ritual landscape. It's very obviously purposely placed there, and I'll get to why in a few minutes. The first obvious clue is when we look at old maps. First of all, it's listed as druidical remains. Now that doesn't really mean anything. All that means is that in the Victorian era, the antiquarians got a little bit excited every time they found a stone, and they just mark everything down as druidic remains. So it was the first clue though, and it was very much for me one of the things that drew me to it. I was interested in druidry. There's this druid stone nearby. I kind of wanted to get to know a little bit more about it, whether I could discover anything from it. But the interesting thing on this map is not that it lists the druidical remains, but there's actually, we've got this boulder on the map, and this small well as well. This field here is called the Pringle Field. I'll come back to that in a moment. And there's also another mark on this map, just here. So we've actually got two little locations here marked as druidical remains, but today we only have the druid stone on that side of the fence, this one here. The interesting thing about that boulder that exists, and in fact the well, is that in terms of the druid stone, that exists on a belting sunrise and southing sunset alignment. So that means that at two times in the year, complete opposite points in the year, we get the sun rising on belting over this boulder stone from the perspective of the druid stone. And from the perspective of the boulder stone, the southing, we get the sunset going over the druid stone as well. So that's our first clue that there's genuinely some kind of ritual alignment or some kind of more in this landscape. But it gets a little bit better than that. So if you noticed on the map there was actually that small boulder on the other side, it was marked as two locations. On this image you can see the druid stone on the other side of the hedge there, but just here is another remains of an old broken stone with some hawthorn trees growing out of it at the moment. Now the problem here was that during the 17th century, when they were building a lot of the local roads nearby, this was a really convenient source of rubble for the roads, so they would just blew a lot of this stuff up with dynamite and used the rubble to fix the nearby roads, particularly at the top on Ricketts Lane, just above where the druid stone location is. And in fact, if we look at the landscape from a little bit further, so still north of the stone at this point, looking down the field, you can see the tree there. So with a little bit of Photoshop magic, we can put the stone back in as it once might have appeared. And then looking at the alignments, what we can see is actually that's on a direct east-west line with the other stone. So that's an equinox sunset and sunrise. So both equinoxes, because of course the equinox is at the midpoint on the horizon. So during either the autumn equinox or a spring equinox, the sun rises over this other stone here in the Pringle Field that's not marked on any of the maps. And of course, if you stood there at sunset on any of the equinoxes, you watch it go down over the two stones. Now, interestingly, there's actually a hole in the druid stone, so it's very possible that there could have been an interplay of light, that you could have had a shadow being cast during the equinox alignments from one stone to the other. And in fact, you may have even had a hole on the other stone that could have done likewise. There could have been anything from a penetrative shadow going through the hole on the druid stone, or any number of other symbolisms that we can only guess at this stage. But I think what we can say is that there's very clearly some alignments in the landscape around the druid stone. And it's not the only thing in the Blidworth area that's very, very interesting. Just up the hill here, we have St Mary's of the Purification, a church dedicated to St Mary of the Purification. Does anybody know anything about Mary of the Purification, what that means?
No, it's a beautiful church.
Sorry?
I just know it's a beautiful church.
It is a nice church, it's a very old church. This particular one was built in the 1700s because it collapsed. A big part of the church collapsed. Only the tower remains from the original. The original goes back as far as the 11th century. Now, Mary the Purification is particularly celebrating the Feast of the Purification, which happens around, depending on which Christian calendar you go with, sometime between the 1st of February and the 14th of February. So if I remember it the right way around, obviously we're going close to the 2nd and 1st of February in this country, but on the Russian Orthodox Church, their feast is much closer to what we know as Valentine's Day. So it's around that early part of February, nearer the purification. So what's very interesting about this church is a custom that survives until this day. Does anybody know anything about the rocking ceremony at Bidwell? I know you. Yeah. So the rocking ceremony at Bidwell is actually a really ancient ceremony. It goes back a lot longer than we have records for. It was initially banned during the Reformation in 1692, but about 100 years later we managed to revive it. And this is a monument that stands sort of in the middle of Bidwell that just sort of reminds people about the rocking ceremony. It is, it's a Tesco now, it used to be a pub that we used to drink it. So the ceremony itself basically involves decking an old cradle out with flowers, with the early flowers of spring. And in the cradle, they placed the baby boy who was most recently baptised. So effectively, the baby boy born closest to Christmas, because they celebrate this around the time of the Feast of Purification. So around 1st, 2nd of February. What they basically do is they put this child in the crib, they put the crib at the bottom of the chancel, they do a bit of a ritual, and then it's over the child goes back to the parents. What's interesting about this particular ritual is the connotations it has. It's very similar to some of the rituals that we have recorded that are dedicated to Brigantia, or to Bridget, Brigid, Bride. There's many names for it. Brigantia is the name I generally fall back on. It's the sort of pan-Indo-European name. But in Ireland we have Bridget, in the north in Scotland it's Bride, Brid, Bridget, Brigantia. If I say them interchangeably through the night, please forgive me. Also my pronunciation on some of the Welsh and Gaelic later gets a little bit confusing, I'll try my best. Yeah, but what's really interesting is there was at least 2 ceremonies recorded in the Golden Bough. The first one is a Hebridean ceremony called Brig's Bed. Basically what they do is they get a sheaf of oats, they dress it as a woman and they put it in a basket. And then they chant a breed is come, breed is welcome. They leave they basically put it in the fire. And I think if I remember right, they put like a club in with the baskets as well. And if the impression of the club remains in the fire ashes in the morning, then it bodes a good year. And if they can't see the club, then it means that they're going to have a bad year. And there are very similar rituals all over the Celtic world. So there's another one that was a sort of before bedtime round. It was breed come in, breed be welcome. And another very similar one from the Manx tradition, which was Bridget, Bridget, come to my house tonight, open the door for Bridget, let Bridget come in. And all of these were invocations to Bridget that would happen around the festival of Bridget, which was on the 1st or 2nd of February. So it's what we could today call Imolc. But and also in the Christian calendar, it's the Feast of St. Bridget. So it's very interesting that we have a ceremony performed in Bidwell that's reminiscent of some of the other rituals from around the Celtic world that were dedicated to Bridget. In a church dedicated to St. Mary of Purification. But it wasn't always dedicated to St. Mary of Purification. There's actually a deeper story here. The first thing I'm trying to get through to you is that there's a very deep link between Bridget and Bidwell. And so we'll build on that a little bit more, but let's use that as the starting kernel for the whole argument around the local gods in this area. And I would start by saying that Bridget is our local goddess. So the church, before the 10th century, in the 10th century, when the Normans first invaded this, they actually built a chapel there called St. Lawrence's Chapel. Now St. Lawrence is also a very interesting character. St. Lawrence is particularly remembered as a converter. He prayed for the conversion of Rome, and so that's one of his things that he's a martyr for, that he helps to establish Catholicism in Rome. But there's also his most famous story, is the story of his martyrdom. And in the story of his martyrdom, because he wouldn't renounce his faith, they grilled him alive, and his final words were, "Turn me over, this side's done." And it's a very famous line, and it's a lovely story. It's a tight fake, but according to the historians, he was actually beheaded, and this is all made up after the fact. What's interesting though is a few of the symbols that we see within images exactly like this. St. Lawrence is always naked, or very nearly naked, and the griddle is very interesting as well, or it could be if we're willing to take certain arguments. What I'm trying to get to though is actually that St. Lawrence in disguise is a remembrance of Lugus, god of light, or Mercury or Perseus for Greek or Roman mythology. All of them are largely remembering the same character. So Lugus is the Brythonic name, again the Pan-Celtic name for the god whose name is Lu, or Lu of the Long Arm, Ludatha, I can't remember some of the other names we've got here. He's often depicted in triplicate form, particularly in Gaul, and we believe that it's Lu who Caesar meant when Caesar said the god that they reverence the most, meaning the Gauls, is Mercury. There are very many images of him and regarding as the inventor of all arts, the god who directs men upon their journeys and their most powerful helper in trading and getting money. So popular that the native term seems to have been dropped and the Gauls instead chose to start calling their imagery of Lugus Mercury. And in fact, Lugus imagery started to adopt more of the Lugus and Mercury unity. He acquired the winged hat and the winged shoes as well. And of course, Mercury is just Perseus from the Greek mythology. Remember, there's the messenger of the gods, but also he's the one that decapitated Medusa. And this is Perseus' constellation in the sky. One of the interesting things about the constellation, some of the symbology, let's talk about symbology, is particularly around St. Lawrence. One of the things St. Lawrence is remembered for is that he had a bag of money and a staff, again, very common icons from the Lugus imagery that we see in Gaul. But the bag of money in St. Lawrence's case was said to be full for the poor and empty for the rich. So we have this sort of duality of the bag, that he could give money to the poor, but for the rich, the bag was empty. But that's reminiscent of various other things as well, particularly the blinking eye of Medusa. Now, the left eye of Medusa in the constellation is actually the famous star Algol, which is not a star, but actually an eclipsing binary, which means that every couple of days, the star fluctuates in magnitude by a full order of brightness. So what we have is effectively this blinking eye of Medusa, or the alternating state of the bag of St. Lawrence. Also in Irish mythology, Lu, for a time, owned the crane bag, and the crane bag was said to be empty at low tide and full at high tide, and it contained some of the treasures of Ireland. So we have this whole bag imagery that contains in the curse of Perseus, the head of Medusa, but in the case of Lugus and Mercury and St. Lawrence, effectively money or treasures. And we have this known link anyway. Now, one of the really big clues to the Lugus and Lawrence connection is actually a meteor shower that occurs every year around the 11th of August, or very close to St. Lawrence's Day, and only a little bit after Lunasa, which of course is the Celtic festival dedicated to Lu. And that's the Poseidon's meteor shower, so named because the Poseidon's meteor shower seemed to originate from around the head of the constellation of Perseus.
Sorry, my legs.
The Poseidon's meteor shower is so named because it originates in the sky from around the head of the constellation of Perseus. Now, in Ireland, the Poseidon's meteor shower is remembered as the Games of Lu. So again, we have another connection between Lugus and St. Lawrence in the constellation. If nothing more, we have a clear indication of the Christian Church attempting to associate St. Lawrence with existing Lugus imagery that they found within the Celtic world. Another interesting point is this whole turn me over, I'm done. Now, it was very, very common several centuries ago to depict star maps in two formats. One from a geocentric Earth point of view, and one from a God-centric sky point of view. So you'd often get constellations, books of sky maps that have both images and flipped sides of the images. And so this idea of somebody writing the story of St. Lawrence without a lot of understanding of what they were looking at in the star maps could give you the idea that perhaps they could be turned over and that the stars may have represented the griddle on which St. Lawrence was cremated. I think that one's a little bit of a tenuous link myself, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. And I think there's enough other evidence to show that Lawrence is simply a remembrance of a lot of the Lugus imagery anyway. which of course brings us back to St Lawrence's Chapel in Blidworth, showing that there's very clearly a connection with Lewis and Blidworth as well. And of course this is held up by a couple of other points. Not far away from Blidworth to the southwest is Oxton. Now, what we have on this picture are two hills. On the left we have the Lolith Hill, I think it's pronounced, which is where they believe the Roman fortification was. And on the right there we have Robin Hood Hill. So the hill named after Robin Hood is very interesting in itself. Robin Hood and fairies and fairy mounds and hills, back to that in a little while, but there's a whole subject to explore at that point. The point is here that actually this is an Iron Age hill fort. This is not an Iron Age village, if nothing else. But what's most interesting about Oxton and Blidworth and the Druid Stone is that they're all on a symbolic Beltane lunar sunrise. Now that might seem like, hang on a minute, how can they be on all of those sunrises at once? I'll show you in a second. But effectively, any time in this talk tonight where I say that something's on a Beltane or lunar sunset sunrise, I mean the other one as well. If you have one, you have all four. And I'll explain why in just a second. The point here is that we have an alignment that captures the four major Celtic festivals running from Old Ox Camp through Blidworth Bottom, straight over the churchyard of St Lawrence's Chapel in the churchyard of the current church, and then hitting the Druid Stone. Now the reason that these alignments are all the same is that you have to think about the way that the sun progresses along the horizon. So if you start with the summer solstice, the sun rises at its most northeasterly point on the horizon, and it gradually works its way down the horizon until you get to from the summer solstice to lunar, and then finally to the equinox where it's in the east, and then further down to Samhain to the winter solstice when it's at its most southeast position. And then of course it goes back through the year, rising back up, and that's why Moloch and Samhain alignments are the same, and that's why Beltane and lunar alignments are the same. And the reason that you get all four is because they're at opposite times of the year. When you get sunset in one direction, sunrise in one direction, the sunset at the opposite side of the year is in a direct line. So a Beltane sunrise, a May Day sunrise, which will be over here, will be the same as a Samhain sunset. Is everybody clear on that? Because it's quite important for the rest of the tour. That makes sense? Excellent. The line goes further. If we continue from the Druid Stone of Blidworth, we go straight through Harlow Wood, missing Friar Tuck's Well with only a few metres. And then eventually we hit Hamilton Hill in Mansfield, which we'll come to in a minute. Friar Tuck's Well was said to be a pagan shrine. Now there is a number of different stories. Oh. If you come through this way, it would have made lots of sense. Friar Tuck's Well is believed to be a pagan shrine. The story goes, I've been unable to verify this or find this anywhere else, I've only heard it word of mouth. But the story goes that when the Vikings were invading, it was a Saxon shrine, a pagan Saxon shrine, and that the priest who attended it gathered up all of the idols and treasure and buried them somewhere in Harlow Wood, and that they remain unfound to this day. So if you do want to meddle in there, maybe Harlow Wood's a good place to start. Might be some really good Anglo-Saxon treasure in there. But as I say, the line continues past Friar Tuck's Well and up to Hamilton Hill. And Hamilton Hill is probably the most important point in this entire talk. Everything else gravitates around it. There's a lot of debate as to what kind of hill it actually is. There are stories that it's really just the waste from when they dug out the reservoir. Other people say that it was built when they built a railway line. None of it's true. It is absolutely an Iron Age burial mound, if not nearly the burial mound. There's a number of things that give it away. First of all, it's of a comparable size to other burial mounds of a similar age. There's a very interesting indentation on the slightly triangular shape, where there's about a 2 metre drop into that gap, and then the 2 metre rise into a central location there, which would have been absolutely perfect. It's a circular mound, but absolutely perfect as a ritual area or as a shrine area. And you can still see to this day the path that sort of leads up to Hamilton Hill.
Where is Hamilton Hill?
Hamilton Hill is across the road from, so it's just over there.
Yeah.
It's across the road from you know when you stood at the entrance to Kingsmill Hop, and you look across the reservoir, there's a hill that stands out. It's an Iron Age burial mound right in the middle of Mansfield between Sutton and right there. It's also built aligned perfectly east and west, which again is an equinox alignment. it's also remembered by another name. It was once known as the Man. And it's from the Man, which in Brythonic, a form of Celtic language, means mother or breast or hill. And we see the same thing at Mantor in the Dark Peak in Derbyshire. Is it Derbyshire or is it South Yorkshire? It's very close.
South Yorkshire.
Is it?
It's on the
There,
border.
the Dark Peak.
It's on the borderline, yeah.
So you see the same thing at Mantor, the same word used to denote a hill. So what it's really saying is mother, breast, hill, the Man. And it is actually from the Man that both Moor and Mansfield take their name. Because Mansfield is the field next to the moor, and the moor comes from the Man. Why is the moor named after it? Well, because the three places where the moor rises are just there, and there, around the base of this hill, within a few hundred yards. There's also been old finds in this location as well. So, they found Roman hoards of coins when they built the road, and also in the 1800s when they built the railway line that runs past it as well. So there's a lot of evidence there to suggest that Hamilton Hill is a very important place locally. But more importantly, I think what we need to get through this stage is it very much has connotations of a mother sense of idea. And bear in mind, we were just talking about Briganta's association with Bridget, with Lidworth. So we're starting to get a bit of an idea of, Briganta potentially as a mother goddess, within a local area. It's tenuous at this point, but build from there. And with thinking about that, it's very interesting to note that that line continues all the way to Mantor. So yes, the same alignment that goes from Old Oxcamp through the Druidstone and Lidworth through Hamilton Hill, extended all the way up to Mantor. So we actually have an alignment link now, solar alignment. These are not ley lines, the traditional idea of, it's just a line of stuff. This is actually a solar alignment. We're not just picking on any old particular happenstance line. We're saying that this one lines up with a particular solar alignment on an important date. There are a few other interesting things along this line, but I think I'll come back to a few of those in a minute. I'd like to first of all point out other interesting things around Hamilton Hill, such as its equinox alignment. So I've not actually been able to find anything to the west of Hamilton Hill, but to the east. Well, it goes directly through St Mary Magdalene's Church in Sutton, which is a very old church with yew trees growing in it, again, the 10th, 11th century church. It goes through Holy Trinity Church, just forget which small village that is, just to the other side of Blackwell, I can't remember. Then it goes through Dethick Moor Stone Circle, our closest stone circle that not many people actually know about. And then eventually it hits High Tor, the big peak at Matlock, or Matlock Bath, where they have the cable cars. So that's a direct equinox alignment between two very important hills. Now, as I said at the beginning, it's more than just solar alignments. There's a whole range of information to start looking at. So the next thing I want to look at is the rivers that are around us locally. I've already stated that the Mourne rises around Hamilton Hill, so we've already started to talk about the Mourne a little bit. But I want to talk about the Idle first of all. And other local rivers. Now, what's really interesting about rivers is they have a tendency to retain their Celtic names. Unlike places and settlements where people move in, and because it's a small settlement, they've decimated everybody that lives there, they can rename and call it whatever they want. A river is a part of a wider community. It's part of a trade route. There are other people that you haven't conquered yet that live on this river. They all know it by a different name. So a river is much harder to rename, which means that a lot of our rivers today retain their Celtic names. The obvious ones are the Derwent in Derbyshire, which means valley of oak trees, Der being oak in Welsh. The Don in Sheffield and Doncaster. Don is the mother goddess in the Welsh pantheon of Danu in the Irish pantheon. And so if we start to look at some of our rivers that we have locally, effectively we have three primary rivers, four if we include Rainmouth Water, but we won't, for reasons that will become clear in a moment. A couple of others as well. So we have the Poulter at the top. I won't talk about the Poulter too much, but it's an interesting name. I couldn't find a lot about it, but what I can say that in Gaelic there is a word that is Pultha, and that means champion or hero, and it's a very similar sound. Now you might think, why would we be looking at Gaelic as a language in our local area, and I'll come to that again. There's a lot to cover, but it's worthwhile bearing in mind at this stage that Gaelic names are worth considering. Then we've got the Meaden, which rises on what is now Bridie Forest Park in Puthwaite, and then it passes sort of to the north of Sutton, so it goes across the north of Mansfield through Closely and on until eventually it joins the Meaden, which runs from Mansfield to become the Idle, or the confluence of the Meaden and the Moor. According to Wikipedia, the confluence of the Meaden and the Moor is the beginning of the Idle. And so we have the Idle running off that way. So on this map, again, as I say, we also have the river in Sutton here. We have the moor sort of here, and then we have Rainworth Water at the bottom, which comes up and joins the moor. And so eventually, as I say, the moor and the Meaden join together. Further on, just up here, the Colt joins the moor, and then eventually it all joins the Trent. The Trent Tristona, the goddess Tristona of the Trent, is the old name, which flowed through Nottingham and London, which around Nottingham. That was previously its Celtic name was Tigolabak, which means city of the cave dwellers. So of course they all dug their own whole caves, whole places of cave system. So I'm not going to talk too much about Poulton. I'm going to focus on the main rivers here, the Idle, the Meaden and the Moor. Now, Wikipedia is absolutely wrong about where the Idle rises. It rises in Sutton Nashfield, hence the name of the Idle Wells shopping centre. It's because it's built on top of the wells that feed the Idle. What's left of the Idle source today is a pond on the Ashlands estate, Ashfields estate, which is kind of just behind where I live. There's a little pond there, there's a duck's shed. It's a nice little pond, I guess, in the middle of a housing estate. What's really interesting though is Rainworth Water. Rainworth Water was not always called Rainworth Water. Some people know it as the Old Idle. Now, consider that that's the Old Idle, what we're saying is that this whole river here is the Idle, and actually the moor is not this bit, it comes from here. In fact, if the Sutton Ashfield rises up here, and the Idle flows through Sutton Ashfield, fills Sutton Reservoir, leaves Sutton Reservoir, joins the moor, sorry, not Sutton Reservoir, the boating lake on Sutton Law, joins the moor and then fills Sutton Res as the moor. There isn't much of an Idle after that. It's the moor all the way from Mansfield. So the Idle is that very short piece in Sutton, and then again further up the river on Markham Moor we have the Idle moving forward again. So there's a really interesting flipping there of the river from the Idle to the moor to the Idle when it joins the Meaden. Okay, so let's bear that in mind, like a flip between the two names. Well, before we get further into that, I just want to come back to the old name for the Rainworth Water being the Old Idle. It was actually renamed to Rainworth Water by a king of East Anglia in 1606. Basically, there was a king who fled the north, King Edwin, he was a due to ascend to the throne, but because of a lot of political issues going on, he fled the throne and he was put up in East Anglia by a king called Athelfred. Which ultimately led to a battle on the banks of the River Idle. It's recorded as a battle on the banks of the River Idle. There were loads of people searching for the location of where this battle happened, all up north on the River Idle. But yeah, what happened though at this battle was that one of the kings that was fighting there, Ragnir, his son died, and his son, I can't pronounce his name, was Raghir, and so they renamed the water to Raghir's Wrath, because of his death on that lake, which eventually, of course, became Rainworth and then Rainworth. And so Rainworth is actually named for the guy that died in that battle in 616, and it was that battle that was seminal to Christianity taking over and putting in this country. It was basically the last stand of the pagan kingdoms, and once that battle was concluded, sorry? That was due to the coal mine which later on. That was a bit of Rainworth that was built up specifically for the coal mine. Rainworth was only a very, very small village. If you know Rainworth at all, at the very bottom of Rainworth, the traffic lights are. There's a little, if you come in from this direction, there's a little street just off to your right there. That was Rainworth. It was just a tiny little house. I used to know a guy who lived there many, many years ago when he used to come into our school when I was a child, and he was originally, I think, the groundskeeper for Joseph Whittaker, who was involved in the whole shooting of the Nightingale as well, so it was a little interesting in there. But yeah, Rainworth was just a tiny, tiny little place. It was basically just a fort on the street. That's what they were naming, it was the fort rather than anything else. But over time, of course, it grew up and it became Rainworth. But what we're saying really is Rainworth is the place where paganism died in the UK. Locally. So anyway, coming back to the River Idle. As I said, the Maiden and the Mourn meet the idol. There's a few other interesting things about the idol. It used to flow underneath and through the basement of BJ Carpets in Celtic Mansfield before originally routed. So you just had to go down into that basement and we'd look for carpets in there and walk where the river used to flow. The only other place you can really be seen is in the car park behind Aslan, between Aslan and Wellcote. Comes out for a few yards, and you can see just a bit of a trickle of the stream. So, naming of the idol, very difficult one to try and pin down. It's currently understood to be Old English for slow or lazy, which is the idolism, the word that we use today. But there are other possibilities. In Brythonic, there is Isol or Idola, or Idol, which means remote or isolated. Doesn't really give us much of a clue, but it's an interesting potential. And then also there is I want to say postfix, but it's not. It's basically a component in Gaelic. The id component that often means a chain or a chain of hunters. And when we were talking about the polter, meaning hunter as well, obviously all linking into the polter, eventually the polter joined the idol. I think it's just an interesting one to note that id, hunter and chain kind of was quite interesting. I don't think I've really pinned anything down with the idol, but it's a subject to continue to explore. No, it's not. And certainly not if you look at the riddle as it's known on Mark and Moor. If you're talking about slow lazy river as a bit that goes through Sutton, then yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's just a trickle. But yeah, the big idol, the big idol,
Have you ever seen the idol well?
it can flood. I know that they can't open the bottom of the car park.
Yeah.
So anyway, the Mourn. I've said it's got 3 tributaries. In Sanskrit, Sanskrit is another Indo-European language that Brythonic and Gaelic both developed from. Mourn means complete silence, which is another interesting thing to look at. And again, as we say, we believe that the name derives from the man in Mansfield and Withersfield. So, moving on to the final river, the Meaden. Now, this is probably the most interesting of them all. As I said previously, it rises in what's currently Briley Forest Park, or also a little area known as Wood End, which is sort of at the bottom of the hill there. And those two sorts of sources rise and bubble up, go through Briley Forest Park to eventually form the Meaden. Now, Meaden is an interesting word. On old maps, it's listed as Maiden, which is an alternative spelling for maiden, as in a young bride or a young maiden. There's also the Gaelic Medhorn, which means middle or meeting place. And if you consider that the tributaries, particularly in the old times when you had the old idol, the Mourn, the Meaden, the Polter, it is kind of in the middle of the 3. So it could be that it just simply means the middle river. And also, it's believed that in Old English it derives to mean a meadow stream, a stream that flows through a meadow. All of these, though, have very interesting meaning, particularly the top one and the bottom, and the maiden and the meadow. You know, we're talking about flowers and maidens and spring. There's a lot of interesting associations there. Which brings us to a very obvious deity from Welsh mythology, Llywydd, the flower face, as it means in English. Llywydd was an interesting character in the story of Lugh. She was created for Lugh as a bride by the magician Gwydion and Math. I'll come to a little bit more of the story later, but the reason that they had to create a flower was because Lugh's mother had cursed him that he could have no wife who was of earth, so effectively no mortal or human wife. So to try and get around that curse, they created him a wife from flowers. Different sources give different flowers. Usually it's 9, but there's often 3. And of the 3, it's always meadowsweet, oak blossom, and broom, all of which grow right around the horizon of the Meaden on Briley Forest Park, which is just sort of coincidence, but it's lovely nonetheless. So we potentially have a Maiden association. There's other maids to consider in Nottinghamshire, obviously, which we'll come to in a little while. But Llywydd being a very obvious association here, and already having an association with Lugh, I just wanted to introduce this one as a possibility. So, we have all of these rivers that ultimately flow to Tristona, to the Trent, but it wasn't always that way. We've had the habit of building canals and rerouting rivers, and in the 1600s we employed Dutch engineers to reroute the Idle and make it empty into the Trent. Before that time it actually used to empty into the Don. Now if Don is very obviously named after Don, the mother goddess, the Platonic mother goddess, then what we have is tributaries, particularly one who's already a maiden association, potentially the Mourn that already has a mother association. We have all these tributaries coming to the great mother goddess Don. It's very tempting to start looking at the idol as a crone goddess at this point, if it wasn't for the fact that there is actually no maiden mother crone goddess in Celtic mythology. There's lots of other triple goddesses, and there's certainly evidence for a pan-European concept of a maiden mother crone, as recorded by people like Robert Graves, which is largely based off of Roman and Greek and Egyptian and Celtic mythology, and he sort of ties all of these threads together to say that he believes there was a maiden mother crone that existed as a primordial, but any recorded evidence to that in any of the mythology is very difficult to find. Instead, what we find is Bridget as a smith, as a healer, as a poetry goddess. You find goddesses like the Morrigan, three goddesses of death and battle. Lou, there's meant to be plenty of triple gods as well. So there's so many triplicates within the Celtic pantheon, but there just isn't an obvious one that's made in Northern Crow. So I'm left sort of not wanting to grasp at that. I don't want to just take that because it's just a little bit too obvious and I can't actually find the evidence for it. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a crone association. A more interesting story would be the Cailleach. Now, in at least two Scottish stories, the Cailleach imprisons Bridget for the winter. It is a seasonal cycle within of itself, that the Cailleach imprisons Bridget, taking Bridget away from the land, induces the winter, and then in the spring, depending on which story, either the Cailleach turns to stone and Bridget's able to escape, or Angus Og will come in and rescue Bridget, but there are various different scenarios, but ultimately Bridget is released. In fact, in one story, the Cailleach travels to a sacred island, drinks from a sacred spring, and becomes Bridget, and is rejuvenated and transformed. What we see then is actually a rejuvenation myth, a recycling myth, that's based on nothing but the goddess, and only in two aspects, not three. It's just youngster and hag, with an obvious growth in the middle somewhere, but it's not really explicitly called out. Another name for the Cailleach is Gentle Anne, particularly for some of the rapids that we have off the north end of Scotland. But Anne is a death goddess concept is very common. You get Black Annis in Leicester, for example. So there are a lot of different Annes that are also very similar to Cailleach type of character. So anyway, nice little interesting divergence. Let's come back to some alignments. This is Hamilton Hill again. So if we look at this time the Beltane sunrise, the May Day sunrise, from Hamilton Hill, the confluence of the Mourn and the Meadle, where the idol supposedly begins, is actually on that alignment. So we have the May Day alignment, sunrise alignment, from Hamilton Hill, looking at the confluence of the Mourn and the Meadle to become the idol. It's beginning to feel like there's just too many associations of this changing, and there's a lot on this landscape. And there's a few other things on this line as well. So we also have Virgin Mary's well in Mansfield. Does anybody know about that? No? Okay, so just to the side of Mansfield Town Centre there is an old well, very difficult to find, but you can get there. There's another mineral spring just outside Mansfield Woodhouse that's on this alignment. And coming back the other way, we go straight through Kirkby Cross before we hit St Helen's Church. So Kirkby Cross, the actual cross that's on the crossroads, is a very ancient cross, supposedly Saxon, but a lot of Saxon crosses were just Neolithic monuments that are carved, which happen to be there. It's very difficult to tell when something's carved. You can't really date the chip on a stone. But this is that, effectively a Beltane alignment. And this is the same alignment we were looking at previously that goes all the way off to Mantor. And we've got a couple of other points on here. So here we have St Catherine's Church in Telson. So really what I'm saying is we've got a few new locations that I'm just pointing out that are on these alignments. And this is, as I say, Beltane and Samhain, Beltane sunrise, Samhain sunset, and lunar sunrise. Yeah, that's the Samhain sunset, sorry, Samhain sunset. You know where I'm going, they're all following there. Okay, so St Mary's Well, look at that beautiful holy well. How well maintained it looks.
I know where that is now.
Do you know where it is? Also known as the Old Bath. There's plenty of talk about it since in the 1800s. It was said that it outpoured nice tap of water, that people could bathe in it. And that's the reason why people have suspected that it was a Roman bath. There's no actual evidence to suggest it was a Roman bath. It's in its current state now because it was a part of the mills that existed in the area at the time. And so all the flagstones and things that are there were part of the mills and allowing the water mills to obviously be production in the 1700s. But it is known as St Mary's Well. And you have to really understand that anytime you see a reference to Mary, what you're really seeing is an encoded reference to the goddess here, which in this area, as I've said a number of times now, is Bridget. Bridget is our local goddess of sovereignty for more reasons I'll come to. So that was very likely a well dedicated to Bridget at some point in the past. Kirkby Cross, I was just talking about on that alignment, doesn't look much now. At one time it's been much higher with an actual cross on it. It's been hit by lorries and knocked over a number of times over the years, and that's how it stands today. It's very likely that this has been around since a lot longer than the Saxons. These two roads are very ancient roads, date back way back into Celtic times. The Romans marched along them, and this would have been an important meeting place. You have to remember that it's not just Kirkby Cross there. You do realise that there's Kirkby Castle right next door. You might not know that there was a castle in Kirkby. All that's left now is the earthworks. But yeah, Kirkby Castle just behind the church that's there. St Catherine's in Tellerson. Now, St Tellerson gets us even further and is very interesting. So again, a very old church, very likely built on a pagan shrine. A lot of these often are. Has anybody ever wondered why churches are dedicated to saints and not Jesus or God? Because we're trying to, they're just continuations of the deities.
Pagan deities
exactly.
being converted to Christianity.
Yeah.
It's what the Romans used
yeah,
to
they
do.
did,
Co-opt the local deity
exactly.
and bring it into saint.
So I couldn't guess as to who St Catherine might be really obvious to start going down the whole goddess of particularly Briganti if there was any evidence for that, which luckily there is. Just outside Tellersaw we have Lady Well. So we've got another well dedicated to the goddess in effect, right outside Tellersaw. And Tellersaw itself is really interesting. We know that it's an old name. Now, the English Place Name Society know it as the Sorcerer's Stronghold in Anglo-Saxon. And we're supposed to believe that that's because in Anglo-Saxon, Terrafi means painter, and that the sorcerers were known to paint their fates, and so this must be the Sorcerer's Stronghold. Unfortunately, I think there is growing evidence, and I found a number of people with a similar opinion, that the English Place Name Society's idea of how things are named is rather antiquated and well overdue an update. In essence, what's largely happened is when they've not been sure, so when they've largely looked to Anglo-Saxon, to Norman, and a little bit to Brythonic and Welsh, but not very often, for their understanding of place name etymology. And often they've looked for things like Thwaite or Ton or Lee as place name endings because they know that then often denote either a town or a clearing in the woods or something like that. And then when they can't understand what the first part of the name is, they say, oh, it must have belonged to somebody called Huffer. So now it's called Huthwaite. That must be the reason why. And it's just not true. There are a lot more possibilities than just sort of inventing a supposed individual that we've no historical records for that may have been that land. In Brythonic, Tefrin means boundary. Now the second part still means fort, so what you actually have is boundary fort. Now there's really good reasons to start thinking about Brythonic and Gaelic languages. The Gaelic languages all effectively developed from a common Celtic language which came from an Indo-European language that every language across Europe, effectively most languages across Europe, is descended from. In terms of the Celtic languages, we have what's known as insular and continental. There are other ways of understanding the split in Celtic languages, like P and Q Celtic. This is a far simpler one for purposes of this talk. Continental Celtic is largely extinct. They don't really speak any of those anymore, but they would have involved Gaulish, Celtic, and what they would have spoken was what's now Germany, France, Switzerland, places like that. Insular Celtic are the languages that were developed within the UK, and they effectively break down into two branches. Early on, and from the earlier Celtic language, we had the Godaic languages, which evolved into Manx, Scotch Gaelic and Irish Gaelic. And they are a lot older than the Brythonic languages. So they developed in this country, and at some point later on, the Brythonic languages developed from the same Celtic roots, but clearly different languages. And they are what we know now as Breton in France. We have Welsh, which is still obviously a very well-spoken language. Cumbric, which is on the verge of being extinct. It's technically extinct because I think the last native speaker is dead, but there's people who do speak as a second language that are keeping it going. And of course Cornish as well, which is still going. So what I want to get through to you though is that it's very likely that the people that inhabited our land, who continued the evolution of the people from the Neolithic, would have been speaking Gaelic at one point or another. And at some point, as the tribes moved around and they jostled for territory, Brythonic speakers moved into the area. And it was the Brythonic speakers that, when the Romans came, that they encountered largely Brythonic-speaking England, up until Ireland and Scotland, where there were more of the Gaelic languages. So it's worth bearing in mind that there could be very, very ancient Gaelic place names surviving within our local area. There's a lot more evidence for that in the Peak District around Mantor than there is here, because of course we also have the Vikings invaders and they renamed a lot of stuff like the Anglo-Saxons. We've had an awful lot of influence over the place name etymology. So anyway, that side, let's come back to some alignments. Ladies well, on an alignment, through St Catherine's, straight through Cuthwaite, and across a hill fort on Strawberry Bank, which is the highest point in Nottinghamshire. So Strawberry Bank is at the top of Cuthwaite. If you know Cuthwaite at all, as you're driving up out of Cuthwaite, you get to quite a high point, you can see all out across Derbyshire. Though there was an Iron Age hill fort there. There was a dig done in the 1980s, a few artefacts were found. It's unpublished, but you can find out about it if you go to the local libraries. It's just from people that wrote about it. They even discovered what they thought was a really old medallion there. I did some research myself online. It turned out it was a lot newer. It was probably written in a sort of what's the way of saying it? Written to make it look like it was older, to make it look like it was ancient, and had a sort of British cross on it also. Got people very excited, but the translation didn't stack up. Straight across Strawberry Bank, then we hit an ancient Saxon cross in a field, which sits between just below Newton and Blackburn, just into Derbyshire there. If we continue to follow that line down, that line goes all the way to another hill fort right down the other side of Derby called Forest Bank. And there are a number of other churches that lie along that route as well that I've not marked on this map. But again, another Beltane style alignment. Loads of them all around this area. I was really surprised. Alignments aside, and moving on to place names, there are some other places that are really worth bearing in mind, such as Bolsover. So Bolsover has a famous castle. Again, it was once an Iron Age fort. Well recorded that that was the case. And also, there's a church dedicated to St Mary and St Lawrence. Hopefully, St Mary and St Lawrence together are really ringing alarm bells at this point. With very clearly the Briganti and Ligas Church, a shrine there. And interestingly, if we look at the name Bolsover, it's recorded as Belsevere in the Domesday Book. Severe in Brythonic means high settlement, it's helpful. And Bel is the god Belenus. This is a Brythonic, and this is clearly attested, this is acceptable even by the English Place Name Society. It basically is the high settlement of Belenus. There are also other local places named the same. So also in the Bolsover district is Belf, which is again named after Belenus, and of course Belford, Derbyshire, takes its root from the same root, its etymology from the same root. And of course, it's all on an alignment. There is a solstice, a winter solstice alignment that rises, so from the perspective of the castle, over the church. And if you follow that alignment right the way down, go past the Roman villa in Leslie, then you hit another Iron Age hill fort, Winnie Hill. Do you know where Winnie Hill is? It's on the border of Mansfield Woodhouse when you turn onto Buford Lane to head towards Edmonstone. It's that corner there is Winnie Hill, and that was, again, another Iron Age hill fort. Peafield Lane, very interesting name. Does anybody really believe that's where they just grew peas? Every year, year on year. And we've been doing crop rotation for a long, long time. Press is going for scrub or bush or thicket land. You know, the land that's just outside of your castle, behind your walls where you're not farming it. So, I'm not saying that it's definitely the etymology of Hayfield Lane, but it's an interesting Gaelic coincidence again. Okay, so we've gone around a lot of place names. I'm going to try and start talking a little bit more about some history, because we've started to build out a bit of a picture now. The Celtic tribes, when the Romans invaded, largely occupied this sort of shape. Nobody's absolutely sure where the borders were, but what we do know is that this border here, between the Brigants and the Coil Tardy, that we are basically stood on, we don't know exactly where that border was. Some people will argue for it being the River Trent, some people will argue for it being the River Meaden and the border that you go through Meaden Vale. Other people will argue it is the limestone ridge that runs along the edge of Nottinghamshire and Marks Derbyshire, where all these hill forts run along. The point is there was a border, and it's very unlikely that that border was static. There was a lot of jostling for space, and because the Romans arrived in the second time in 47, 43 AD, doesn't mean to say that that's how the borders have always been. It's very likely that the Brigantes, as a very powerful big tribe, have spread backwards and forwards across where we stand now as their fluctuating border many, many times. I wouldn't be surprised if the Tristiona was the border. I wouldn't be surprised if the Limestone Ridge was the border. That it's probably been at different points, different locations, which would explain why we have an obvious association to Briganti in the rocking ceremony in Lidworth, and also the fact that it's a church of Mary of the Purification. It's Briganti is the patron goddess of the Brigants. She was the sovereignty goddess of the Briganti tribe. So when you're talking about, well, if the Brigants occupied this land, then very obviously Briganti was the sovereign goddess who occupied this land too. So as we talk about the mother goddess of the land, thinking about the associations with the map, that's where we start to get more of a solid association between Briganti and the area that we're living in now. Of course, we've already had the Lugus stuff. It was definitely the limestone ridge that was the border most of the time. That's why there's so many hill forts built along it. And it's an absolutely ideal strategic location. You're at the highest point along the border, looking out across Derbyshire with an absolutely perfect strategic vantage point to see any armies coming. And so you have a fort at Puthway, you have Teversall just on the hill there, the Skegney and Newbound below. Also, for a little bit further up, Clown, another Celtic name. Further on, I don't think I've got that written down with me today, but Clown, again, is a Celtic name. The boundary ridge is clearly visible on this map from the 1830s. You can sort of see it running along here. It's just another indication that this boundary is a clear piece of topographical landscape that would be very important to the people that lived here at the time. So the Brigants. We do actually know a little bit about the Brigants. We know that when the Romans invaded, that it was Queen Cartmandu who was their leader, and she was a queen in her own right. She wasn't the king, wasn't with the king as well. She had a husband who was her consort, but he had no royal powers or any rights. He was just a common, the same as anybody else. She was the queen of her people. Now, when the Romans invaded in 43 AD, the rebellion that was organised among the Celtic tribes was led by a guy called Cracticus. And he fought the Romans for effectively a good 10-year campaign until eventually he was beaten. There are two places where he may have been beaten. One is in Wales and the other one is in Shropshire, just over the border of Derbyshire. There's a hill that's named after him. And we think that might have been the location that's on stand. Either way, the Romans caught his family and he got away. And he fled to the Brigants, seeking refuge with the Queen of Cartmandu. But she had already made a pact with the Romans and she handed him over. So she gave him over to the Romans, which led her husband to get quite pissed off. Her husband was a guy called Ventius, and when he left, he was already quite angry with his queen anyway because she was sleeping around. She was sleeping with his stable hand, a guy called Voluptus, and so she made him a husband. Venticus left, and he reorganised the rebellion and continued to lead the rebellion for a good 10 years, living all over the place, effectively fighting alongside a lot of the Scottish tribes. And nothing is recorded else in history of exactly what happened to him. But we do know what happened to Cracticus. So he was actually taken to Rome, and he was put in front of, the Senate, yes, in front of the Senate, and he had to effectively explain himself. And he was so eloquent and so concise in what he said that he moved all of the Roman senators. They granted him Roman citizenship, gave him back his family, and allowed him to live out the rest of his days in Rome. It's an interesting bit of history there. So he turned after fighting him for 10 years. Then what we're getting to, though, is we're beginning to understand a little bit more about who I'm potentially saying could have been the gods of this area. Brigid, Bride, Briganti, Bellimus, Belli, Noir, Lugas, Moon, whatever you want to pronounce them, and maybe some others. Is there anybody else that we're not looking at? Are there any other obvious things that we should look at in the local area beyond these alignments and churches and name associations that we might find? Well, there are a couple of clues. So there is St Anne's Well in Buxton. I'm sure you probably all know about this. St Anne's Well, also known as Aquae because of course it was only one of two places in the whole of the UK that the Romans deemed worthy of the name Aquae, the other one being Bath. Aquae basically means the springs of the goddess of the sacred grove. So that's an interesting one. Currently dedicated to St Anne. Interesting grove, darkness, and associations with bearing in mind for a few minutes. Also, not far away, in the opposite direction, in Pagan, we have a relief to Moot, which is found in an old graveyard, a Roman graveyard. Often depicted with another god, Sculus. I think he was found there as well. She usually holds either a house or a honey comb on a stick, and also a crow is often depicted with her, which has led a lot of people to associate her with the Morrigan of Irish mythology. But there's nothing else beyond that. She's much better known in Gaul and in France than she is in the UK, but this relief was found in England. So yeah, Aquae Omnitia, Mantu Selecta. Finally, Willoughby on the Wolds, a little town just south of Nottingham. You see Clifton up there, so it's very south Nottinghamshire. Used to be called Vernemerton. So we have Vernemerton, Mantu Selecta, and Aquae Omnitia. All three of them in common all have the same root word, Nemetona, which means sacred grove, or goddess, or Nemeton, sacred grove. Nemetona is the goddess of the sacred grove. Very well understood goddess from Gaul, called by Caesar during the Gaulish campaign. Basically a spirit of the forest grove. And because all three of those names are derived from that same Nemetonian goddess, it's worth bearing in mind that there could have been some wider Nemetonian association within the area. We're looking south of us, west of us, east of us. We've not found anything north, but everywhere else. And Nemeton's an interesting word as well, because it's another one that's very, very often overlooked in place name etymology. There is a place in Mansfield, just off Rosemary Street, that used to be known as Newton Town. Now, the accepted etymology of Newton, and it's the most common place name in the whole of the UK, Newton. Most of them are understood to be New Town, which is where a group of people who move over here, we're going to build a new town, we're just going to call it New Town, it's not very imaginative. Worse, we're going to call it Newtown Town, because that's how imaginative we are.
Like New York.
The other alternative is that it could have been Norman Town, and of course we often believe that ton is an Anglo-Saxon ending meaning town. Nemeton ends in T-O-N, and it's well attested as place name etymology throughout most of the rest of the Gaelic world. We should consider Newton as a potentially derived, at least in some instances, from Nemeton.
Is that thing up Lady?
Yep, that's Westfield Lane, that's Rosemary Street, there's the council offices, so it's just there, where those buildings are now. Is that Mansfield's sacred grove? It could be. I can't, these are just, I can't prove or disprove any of this stuff, but it's all very interesting information. Why would you call it Newtown Town? And they never built a town there either. It's the council offices now. It was always, the town wasn't being thrown away. It's usually, like I say, it's understood to mean either a place that we're going to move to or a place of planned expansion by a town. We don't know for sure. There are other names that are worth looking at. Claudwell, everybody know Claudwell Brook, Claudwell Street, the top end of Mansfield, just down from Hamilton Hill. So Claudwell Brook, we'll find that on the map. You'll also find Claudwell Dam. Claudwell, English, cold, yes, makes it obvious, doesn't it? Except that in Gaelic it means dam or weir, and we know that Claudwell is a dammed river. Does it really mean cold? It's supposed to be because the water's somehow colder than the other water. We don't know. I've not tested the water myself, but in Gaelic, Claude, spelled the same way, means dam in a river, or weir, where you catch fish. And there are other place names locally that are interesting and worth a look at. How about Carlton? Farm of the Calves? Really? In the middle of Sherwood Forest? Where are the fields? There were Roman marching camps nearby. There's a huge path through the forest. Calver in Gaelic means causeway. Path through the forest. Is it really the town of Calves, or is it the causeway through the forest? I suspect it's probably the latter. There are others that get a little bit more tenuous as you go on. Annesley. Lee means clearing in the woods. I think of Brythonic rather than Gaelic. And Anne's in some modern Welsh words means lady, as in Albanes, which is Scottish lady, Americanines, which is American lady. Also, Ains can mean restless, uneasy, or haunted, as in Ainsworth, which means haunted. So Annesley, a clearing in the woods, potentially associated with a lady, potentially some kind of darkness association. We have a Black Annis, Calige association with Annesley. Again, as I said, they get more tenuous as they go on, but interesting to note down nonetheless. Perhaps we'll find something more later on. Okay, we're going to move into food. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's difficult to do any local investigation into folklore, mythology, and other sort of related subjects without coming across Robin Hood. Obviously, he fills the pages. Initially, I was quite dismissive. Far too late for this subject matter I was interested in. I was looking for far older stuff. And obviously, I made the assumption it was just Middle Ages. But I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Robin Hood may go back far further than that. So, of course, at the moment, there are largely two major schools of thought in Robin Hood. The first one is that he was a historical person that existed sometime between the 12th and 13th century. The earliest ballads that we have recorded in Robin Hood all date to around the 1450s to 1500, and then some of the old ones go as far as the 1600s as well. The early ones are things like Robin Hood and the Guy of Gisborne, The Jest of Robin Hood, Robin Hood and the Plotter, and then later on you get things like The Death of Robin Hood as well. One of the earlier recordings that we have before any of that, before any of the ballads were written down, is we actually have a record of a payment to a group of actors in a Robin Hood play, a payment for 20 pence. I don't know how many there were, but it was quite a good payment.
Probably 20 pennies.
Maybe. And there are other related outlaw figures throughout history that have contributed their deeds to the Robin Hood mythology, particularly the Derbyshire outlaw William Venables, who's credited with breaking out some of his outlaw friends from Nottingham Castle. It was very well recorded, very daring out. He went to Nottingham, rescued a load of people, and off he went into the woods. And the bishop at the time actually recorded it saying, it was a bit like he was Robin Hood and his merry men. So the idea is that even back then, the idea of Robin Hood as an outlaw was quite well established. In fact, going back even further to the 1200s, we can start to look at who might have been the original Robin Hood character. One of the characters that comes particularly up is the idea is that there's a guy called Robert Le Fairview in Berkshire. Now, the interesting thing about him is that the next year he's recorded of having committed a crime, and in the next year they changed his name to William Rob Hood. So what we have is that even in the early 1200s, there was already a common idea that it was okay to change a criminal's name to Robin Hood, that Robin Hood was a name for a common criminal. So even as far as that far back, Robin Hood was a well-established name. So why is it that even really early on, Robin Hood is a well-understood name for a criminal? Why is it demonised? Why is it outlawed? or like a lot of other things that the Christian church didn't like about paganism, the outlaws, which is turn things into outlaws. So the idea of a character effectively becoming an outlaw is exactly the same sort of thing. They're trying to say that this character name, this Robin Hood that you understand as something good at the moment, we're going to say that when you're a criminal, you're called one of those, therefore we've put that negative association on it. It was interesting to note as well that in the early ballads, the Robin Hood that is in those ballads is nothing like the Robin Hood that we know today from the films and the stories. For one thing, he never gave money to the poor. It was always, it wasn't even particularly Robin the Rich. Actually, the main antagonists in the sorry?
It was Robin priests and churches.
Correct, it was the church, although particularly corrupt bishops, official bishops. I don't think I've got the actual quote written down. There was basically a quote from the jest that I had at one point in this slide there. It was along the lines of, forget all of these other people, it's the bishops and the archbishops, they're the corrupt ones, watch them, and sure, if you want to watch him until he's a troublemaker. But yeah, the idea is that there was this idea that a criminal, anybody who was a criminal, was named a Robin Hood. But why is that? Where does those names come from? Well, there is an even earlier association, and that's that payment to the actors. And the truth is because Robin Hood is intimately associated with May Day. And this is something as well, there's been several books written about this already, it's nothing new that I'm presenting. But the idea is that Robin Hood is well remembered as part of the May Day celebrations. He was often the character that would become the King of the May. Often, in fact, he would lead the villagers as a leader of the village, and going and collecting money from the next village over as a way of collecting money for the local church or for a good cause in their local village. It was quite a common thing for to go and rob the other village, if you like, in a very playful May Day sort of way. And of course, he led the revels. And there were a lot of other interesting characters around the May Day. The Green Man, Jack in the Green, all of these characters. What I guess we're trying to push particularly towards at this point is Robin Hood as the fairy, as Hook, as Robin Goodfellow. Hook, of course, is remembered from Midsummer Night's Dream. And also, of course, there's all the associations with Robin Hood around bows and arrows and wearing green. These are all things that are well established in fairy folklore as well. Really, fairies wear green and they're very good archers. And in fact, at the May Day celebrations, as well as erecting the maypole, one of the other things that used to get erected was what we used to call fairy bowers or Robin Hood bowers. I haven't got a very good image of this, but it's the best I can find. But the idea was there was a tent or an enclosure that was a Robin Hood or fairy enclosure. And in the May Day celebrations, all sorts of mischief would occur in the woods between the maidens and the young men, and people find places to hide. The next association Robin Hood has, which is very similar, is as Robin Hood the Hunter. We all know that Robin Hood is famed for stealing the king's deer, for being an excellent hunter. And of course, ever since the 1980s, you're always going to get the association with Her the Hunter, because of the Robin Hood TV series. But the idea of Robin as the hunter and Her the Hunter is nothing new. They put it into the TV series because it was in theory that already existed out in the wild. Her the Hunter is well understood to be a character that's quite closely linked to Wonders of Forest. But I guess one of the most interesting things really is not necessarily Her the Hunter himself, it's the idea of wearing horns. And that wearing horns has been part of our culture in Britain for many generations. And it's something that the church have tried to actively suppress. In fact, in the 7th century, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he said, whoever it is that goes around as a stag or a bull and making themselves into wild animals and dressing themselves in the skins of herd animals, putting the heads of beasts, who's in such transformation themselves. Yeah, he blabbed on a bit, but he was basically saying it's a horrible thing. Don't put the antlers on my head. They were trying to denounce it. And of course, it's not the only one. And the hunter is a horned goddess. There's Sunnis from the Goddess Cauldron as well, that was found in Denmark. And there are over 50 depictions of Sunnis all across Gaul, but not a lot of Sunnis information in the UK. But what we do believe is that we feel is a god of the wild, a god of the nature spirits, a god of the green wood. But the hunter, which of course leads us on to the wild hunt. Is everybody familiar with the motif of the wild hunt? Basically, the idea is that the wild hunt rides out at Samhain or at May Day, rounding up the souls of people that died that year and taking them to the underworld. And through different mythologies, it's been led by different characters. So Woden or Odin is often seen as leading the hunt, but also Gwyn ap Nudd from Arthurian and Welsh mythology, and also Arawan, the ruler of Anwan in Welsh mythology, the ruler of the underworld. He was also a leader of the hunt. Gwyn ap Nudd, when he's leading the hunt, his dogs are called the Hounds of Anwan. So it's very much an association between Gwyn ap Nudd and Arawan there, between the two.
That's the same wild one that's in the ghost story down Cornwall, don't you know, the Cornish one?
Yeah, exactly the same thing.
I was going to say, I know there's a ghost story down Cornwall, it's got the wild ones in it.
Yeah, it's a popular motif all across the UK. The Green Man is the other major aspect of all of this. Jack in the Green, and that the Green Man, wildwood attribute of Robin Hood, the person who is sort of the king of the woods, an intimate relationship with the nature and the spirit of the woods. So these are all really good, interesting associations with Robin Hood, well documented, a lot of books and other theories out there. So I want to move on to something slightly different. Let's talk about Robin and Wren, Robin's namesake, the Robin itself. Now it's from the Robin, I think, that we can start to get clues about the true antiquity of the Robin Hood mythology, and that it's not just a set of ballads that were written down in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. Incidentally, around the time that common people started writing down more ballads, because the bardic colleges of Ireland and Wales were being shut down. So professional poetry, professional storytelling was in decline, with the sort of the travelling minstrel was on the rise. There's a lot more of the common people mythology being there. Cock Robin, Robin Redbreast. So, is everybody familiar with the idea of minstaves? In the 16th century, it became very common for Christians to use what are called minstaves, and it was the practice of substituting one word for another word so as to not cause offence or to cause blasphemy. So it was particularly common to substitute the word God for gok or cock, particularly in Scotland. So cock is another word for God in minstaves. So when we're talking about Cock Robin, what we're actually saying is the god Robin. In Gaelic, cock really actually means to encase or enshrine, to embody. So what we're saying is that the Robin is the embodiment of the god in this ontology of the word. It's not necessarily that it's the god himself, but he's the representative on earth, in much the same way as Jesus is the representative on earth of God. In Scotland, the Robin was known as the Ruddock, and Ruddock in Gaelic comes from the Gaelic Rudari, and Rudari means red king. Ruddock is very easily shortened to Ruddy. And during the evolution of languages, substitution of O's and U's in vowels is very common. Vowel switching is very, very common between language substitution, as is switching D's for B's. So it's only a very small jump from Ruddy to Robin to get Robin from the Gaelic Ruddock or Rudari. The problem is, of course, that if all this is true, then this was all in existence in the British Isles before the Christians came, and the Normans in particular, introducing the French name Robert, which we always presume is the word that we get Robin from, that Robin is just a familiar form of Robert. But if in fact the name Robin was extant in some other way, or a very similar sounding name existed within the UK already, it would have been very easy to attach that Robert name to something that already existed, and to himself in the Red King of Rudari. So Cock Robin in Gaelic very literally translates as the Red King God. It's very interesting. But what about the Wren? Now, the Wren's got a lot of mythology here. Let's look at Wolf Scarlet. So there was another ballad in 1650, around 1650, called Robin the Newly Revived. And in it, Will stated that he was Robin's own sister's son, and that in Mansfield he was bred and born, and that his name was young Gamwell. Now, if Will's name is Gamwell, that's quite interesting, because there's actually another poem in the 14th century, A Tale of Gamlin, which is only one letter different, Gamlin and Gamwell. And in this tale, Gamlin effectively is dispossessed of his land as a baby, so he's effectively inherited, his father dies, he's a young baby, inherits his land, he's dispossessed by his older brother, and he ends up spending his life fighting for his land. For a time he joins a band of outlaws led by an outlaw king, who is not named, and then eventually he manages to get his land back, and the story ends. But there's also another tale called Robin and Gandrin, which is not normally considered to be a Robin Hood tale. There's no evidence in it directly that it's a Robin Hood tale. But in the tale, what happens is that Robin, the unnamed Robin, and somebody called the Renwick of Don challenge each other to a contest. And the contest is to shoot each other in the heart with a bow and arrow. Now, the Renwick of Don in this story kills Robin, but then Will Scarlet is the one that then takes the final shot and avenges his killer. And so they both die. Both the Robin and the Wren die in the story. Well, what's more interesting is the name, the Renwick of Don. So we're basically saying the Wren of Don. Now, we've previously looked at Don as the mother goddess, D-O-N, but there is another Don that's worth considering. I'll come to in a few minutes. The whole story as well of shooting the wren is really familiar if you're familiar with the story of Lugh in Welsh mythology. In the story of Lugh, Lugh earns his name, which is Lugh Lorgathus, which means the lion with the steady hand, because as I said previously, Aaron wouldn't name him. And so what happens is Gwydion casts a spell on them, disguises them as shoemakers, and sails them into port. And there, Ironwood sees from her castle that there's some new shoemakers in town, and so she sends the maids down to ask her for a pair of shoes to be made. And so Gwydion, in disguise, with Lugh also in disguise, make a pair of shoes and send them to the castle, but they're too small. So they get sent back down, of course, we go and make another pair of shoes, except this time they're too big. And so, of course, eventually Ironwood has to come down and speak to Gwydion and Lugh herself, and ask if she can actually get shoes in the correct size. And Gwydion, of course, says, now that I can measure them correctly, of course I can make shoes in the right size. But just at that moment, a wren lands on the boat that Gwydion and Lugh are in. And without any thought, with quick reflexes, Lugh throws either a stone or the needle, depending on which version of the story, and the needle pierces between the bone and the sinew on the wren's leg. And if you know a wren, that's one of the smallest birds, its leg is very, very tiny. So what we're suggesting is that the most accurate of shots to kill the wren. But the important point there is it's a wren, and it's a very accurate shot. In fact, the name wren itself has lots of easy to identify associations. In the Netherlands, wren literally means old king. So with the robin, we have a red king, and with the wren, we're already starting to see an old king. And of course, in this country, we have the whole tradition, or in these countries, we have the whole tradition of the wren boys. Isn't it familiar with the wren boys? The Christmas hunting of the wren, or Boxing Day hunting of the wren. And so it's quite a big tradition across the country to actually hunt a wren on Boxing Day. There are a number of reasons given for why they hunt the wren, but it's largely seen as to be retribution for killing the robin. And there are a number of things that are quite interesting about the wren boys. Often, it involves three particular things. It involves a trick, absurdity, and hostility. And these things are seen throughout all of the mythologies as well. So with the actual killing of the wren, the trick was often in placing the wren in the box, and the question would be, would you like to see the king? And of course the trick is that wren means king. When you open up the box, you see just a dead wren, you haven't actually seen the king, so there's a trick involved. And likewise, in the story, Gwydion and Lugh are tricksters, and they trick Ironwood into giving Lugh first his name, then his armour, and then finally, she doesn't give him the wife, but he gets a wife. That's what the curse that Ironwood places on him. The wren's name in Welsh is Druid, which is related to Druid is an oak tree, Druid is a druid. It's a very important bird to Welsh mythology. And of course, sorry, to come back to the hunting of the wren, there's the other things, the absurdity. The absurdity in the story is the ability to flow something through between the sinew and the bone of the leg. It's just an impossible shot. When the wren was killed, they would often make a big meal about how they would transport it back to town. Sometimes they'd have to bring in the two biggest guys, strap it to a big pole and carry it between the two of them, as though it was a huge deer. So there's this whole silliness around the whole thing, this whole absurdity around the idea. And in the hostility, in the story we have the hostility of Gwion and Ironwood. There's a lot of hostility between Gwion and Ironwood. Ironwood is really upset with Gwion, A, for the fact that Lugh was born and the whole thing was an accident, and secondly for the fact that he's continued to try and get her to acknowledge him, and she finds it shameful that she had a child when she was supposed to be a virgin. And within the story, well, the Wren boys were often masked. So not in the story, within the Wren rituals, well, the Wren boys were often masked, and they were demanding money from people sometimes. So sometimes, there may well have been good reasons to mask up and protect your identity, but there was often a little bit of hostility within that. Just want to bear in mind as well, Jenny Wren. So we've talked about Cock Robin, and we've talked about Wren, but we've not talked about Jenny too much yet. I'll come back to that in a moment. But first of all, where could Wren come from? Well, there's another name in Gaelic, Green, which sounds a lot like Wren, Green, and it means king woman, or more accurately, maiden queen, which is pretty much a direct reference to Brigantia when you're talking in Gaelic, because, well, Brigantia is patron of pretty much the whole of the north. It's also the same root word of Rhiannon in Welsh mythology, the horse goddess, another goddess of sovereignty. So it's possible that Wren could at least be associated with Re. And there's another word as well. If you substitute the E, Ren from A, then you get Ran. And that's another word that's used quite commonly in association with Bridget. So there's an old Scottish prayer, if you like, for people that were deemed too long to be alive. So if you were getting a bit old and weary and you decided that your time was up and you had enough, then there was a whole ritual that you could partake in where, and part of that ritual involved somebody shouting through your keyhole, the Ran's flesh has come, get out of thy way. So the idea was that Ran's flesh, or Wren's flesh, was somehow old king, and therefore needed to be gotten rid of. Interestingly, the word for Robbie that we were looking at earlier, Ruddock, can also mean, another translation in modern Gaelic, is haggard old woman. So we're getting this association between both Robin and the Wren, of both being the maiden queen, the haggard old woman, and either the Red King or the Old King. But what we're seeing is an awful lot of confusion around exactly who takes on what role, where it all fits together. I think what we're starting to see though is that the whole thing. Oh, sorry. So I just wanted to come back to the idea of sovereignty. Obviously, we talked about Rhiannon a moment ago, Brigantia and politics sovereignty. We talked previously about how Brigantia has her own regeneration mythologies. Well, there are other ones as well where the hag often represents the goddess of sovereignty. In one Irish story, there's a story about a guy called Neil. And the story effectively goes that Neil and his four brothers were out, they needed to get a drink from this well, and each in turn went to the well, and when they got there, they saw this haggard old woman, they got scared, and they would leave, and she wanted a kiss from them. And each in turn went, so each one was scared, until eventually Neil went forward. He agreed to kiss the hag, and of course as soon as she did, she turned into a beautiful young maiden, and she explained to him that her being a hag was representative of the fact that the sovereignty of Ireland was not easy to win. The kiss represented the sovereignty of Ireland. And there's another story as well, if you're familiar with Arthurian legend, Gawain, Gawain and the Green Knight theme. Well, in another story, Gawain actually gets married to a hag, and when they finally go to the bedchamber at the end of the night, she changes into a beautiful young woman, and she says to him, I can be beautiful either during the day and a hag at night, or I can be a hag at night and beautiful during the day. Which one would you prefer? And because he says, it's your choice, and grants her sovereignty, she says that's the right answer, and she can now, the curse is lifted, and she can now be peaceful all the time in her true self. So there are a number of instances where this transformation between hag and maiden has an association with the granting of sovereignty. We just want to bring it back a little bit to when we talk about rivers and the flipping between the maiden and the idol, and the maiden and this hag-maiden association, and another potential piece of symbology that we might want to look at. But what it'll get into, I guess, is that the whole thing is a big story of summer and winter kings. The Robin being the summer king, the Wren being the winter king. And it's described over and over again. Gawain and the Green Knight, another story of the winter, the Holly and the Oaken King, the Robin and the Wren. In Coolwich and Orwen, you also have Gwynap Nud, who I talked about earlier as one of the leaders of the Wild Hunt. Well, in the Culhwch and Erwin story, Gwynedd Nudd actually abducts his sister, Cerid Lad, because he doesn't want her to marry Gwenfrey, and in the end, after much to and fro-ing, King Arthur decides that to solve it, they have to battle every May Day from now until Doomsday, and whoever wins on Doomsday will finally take her hand in marriage. And so again, there's another instance of this mythology of the turning of the seasons, the battle between the two kings for the hand of the goddess of sovereignty. So I want to come into the death of Robin Hood a little bit now. So we talked a little bit about the death of Robin and the other one a minute ago, but in the actual tale of the death of Robin Hood, there are a number of other interesting things. First of all, we know that he's led by the prioress of Cleves, which she does so because she's in love with Roger of Doncaster. Doncaster again. So two instances where we've had the Robin killed, first by Renard of Don, and now by Robin of Doncaster, we again have this association between Don and whoever it is that's at Robin's demise, or the demise of Robin. There is a Don in Irish mythology which is spelled with two N's, and he's a god of the underworld, a king in fact, a ruler of the underworld. There are other interesting motifs within the Robin Hood death story that lead you to believe that it's got more detail in it. The fact that there is a line of women who line the procession effectively to the priory where he's going to die, even though he hasn't yet been bled. There's like this whole lamentation of, very similar to people who lamented Jesus as he was carrying across him to the top of the hill. On the journey, he meets a washerwoman at the ford, which is a very common motif for a harbinging of death. So the death of Robin Hood, again, gives us another little clue to this whole Robin Wren thing. So let's for a moment, just a very short moment, talk about Maid Marian, because the truth of the matter is, the whole thing really is about Maid Marian. The two kings are fighting for the hand of the flower maid, but there's definitely a confusion of roles going on. This confusion can also even be seen in some of the stones and hills that are dedicated to Robin. Often when you find a stone or a hill dedicated to Robin, it's also dedicated to the lady. So if Robin is just the earthly representative of the goddess or of the Red King, why dedicate it to Robin and not the goddess? Why both is interesting. It's known that Maid Marian didn't join the Robin Hood stories until quite a lot later. We believe that she came from the May Day Games. Well, what I'm suggesting here is that actually Robin Hood himself came from the May Day Games as well. So what we have really is that Maid Marian was really just a reintroduction to a story. If the Gaelic term for Red King, Maid and Queen didn't have any sexual connotations, and the deity was actually more of an androgynous entity with no direct sexual identification, then when the French came and introduced the term Robert, it would have made Robin resolutely a male name. And so any female association would have been lost, which would make perfect sense for the reintroduction of Maid Marian later on into the story, to reintroduce the missing feminine part that had been lost since the Normans invaded and introduced Robert and solidified him as a male name. So, rigging is which is the word we used to look at, wren, which is pronounced wren, has another form, which is also ribbon, which turns up in Welsh in Gwrach ribbon, which means the hag of the mist. So, in Gaelic, rigging means maid and queen, but by the time it makes it into Welsh, it's changed to hag. So again, we have this flipping of the maid and hag association. And it happens quite a lot, this flipping of the maid and hag. So let's try and get some flesh on this now. I'll try and really lock it down to where we are. Robin. The two etymologies that we've looked at are from Rudari, which means the red king or haggard old woman, and Rehi, which means king woman or maiden queen. And for the Ren, we've looked at Rehi, which means king woman, maiden queen, and we've also looked at Ran, which means hag crow. So, we're nearly getting to the end. I apologise if it's getting a bit long, but I just wanted to talk about Little John. So Little John, the first story we have from him is from 1420, he was well known as a character in the May Games in Scotland long before that, which is very interesting. And also, in the 12th century, not long after the Norman invasion, the term Little Johns was used to refer to Cornishmen, later to Welsh people, but specifically to Cornishmen. Now, the normal explanation for that is that the Cornishmen were either small in stature or that they were all committed to King John in some way, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Why were they called Little Johns? No one really knows.
Wasn't it something to do with the Pixies?
Sorry?
Wasn't it something to do with the Pixies? Was another name for the Cornish Pixies in Cornish John?
It could well be, because John is a very interesting name in of itself, as we're about to see. So ordinarily we think that John comes from Hebrew, which means God is gracious, but there was no Hebrew-speaking community in this country at that time. So the chances of it retaining that meaning are very slim. It probably would have had some other meaning. Now what we do have is a reference to Jenkin as another name for Jack in the Green, who was associated with the May Games. And in fact Jack is just a nickname for John. Interestingly, Jenkin as a name was unknown before the 12th century. However, it does appear in the Domesday Book a couple of years before that. So where did it come from if it didn't come from the Normans? Well, if we translate Jenkin to Gaelic, we end with Senshir. And if we presume that the name may have been originally translated from Gaelic, then we can guess that Senshir must be somewhere close to the word that was originally Gaelic that was translated into one of the Old English, I guess it was the next time, and then back we would end up with Senshir. Senshir means old head, and is actually used in County Cork as in Senshir there. And head means head in two ways. It means head as in the head of people, as in meaning chief in Welsh, but it also means the head as in the head of a piece of land or a peninsula, which of course the Cornish people would have been on. So Little Johns could simply have been a reference to the fact that they lived on the end of a piece of land, which from England would have very much been the head. Yes. The obvious story of the Little John is him fighting Robin Hood on the loch. Of course, nobody dies in that story. Instead, it's much more of an example of the rather than a sacrificial king, it's more like a king that needs help, like the fisher king in Arthurian mythology. And also another example of this is Hwyl and Owen in Welsh mythology. And it's the idea that the king somehow can't rule on his own. He needs a third party to step in, rule for him, and perform some sort of action. And that's effectively what we're seeing in the Robin Hood tale there with the fight between Little John. Robin submits and loses to John, but ultimately Robin wins because he's got the whole army of people around him. And John effectively submits to Robin and joins his band, and then becomes his lieutenant, his second in command, his chief. So the two kings, if you like, working together equally. So if we have the name Jenkin existing at this time, well then Jenny is just a familiar form of that, just a shortened version of Jenkin or John. So that's where we get the Jenny Red from. It's just another form of, it's just another association of the old king. So where are we? Well, we have Robin, who's the Red King, the King of Summer, solar deity, so we could be looking at Belinus, Afghan, Luke. We have Ren, the old King of Winter, the underworld deity, so we could potentially be looking at Awen, Selunus, Gwynat Nod, Baelor, or Don. We're not really sure at this point, but of course we only have a few names that we've picked up from the landscape. So, coming back to the River Don again, what if Don is not actually the goddess Don, but rather the death god Don? As in the relic of Don and the Russia of Don. Can we get any clearer than this? So at the point, I feel that right now, the local gods are Briganti, Bridget as the maiden queen, Celtic's mother, Robin and the Wren, and we still clearly have an association between Lugus and Belinus. Lugus traditionally is understood to either be a craftsman, or a god of storms. It could be a god of storms based on his name, or it could be a sun god based on his name. But he's also within mythology often involved in oaths, and he's a trickster god as well. Belinus we have a lot less information about. It doesn't exist in any of the mythologies, but we do have him associated with both Hebrew gods, the sun, and the ancestors of Belinor. And if you look at the Welsh pantheon, you can kind of see some of this. Belinor is the ancestor of pretty much everybody else we've been talking about. Luke comes down here. So, can we get it any clearer? Can we guess at what time all of this might have come about? Because what we're really trying to get to is, I guess, this picture of the solar alignments, these various points on the wheel of the year. gods and goddesses of the local area and the mythology that surrounds that. So, with the mythology of Lu, it's very interesting to look at how Lu dies, and maybe able to understand the placement of the actual points in the year where these things are. Before we move on to Lu's death, I just want to talk a little bit about births and solstices. So, we all know that the winter solstice is largely a celebration of the birth of Jesus, or the birth of the sun god. Well, we all know as well that the saints all have their own days. And in general, the Saints' Day is a celebration of the day of that saint's martyrdom, their death, the day that they became a saint and that they were reborn into heaven. That is all except one case, and that's St. John, whose Saint's Day is the 24th of June, just a few days after the summer solstice, in much the way that Christmas is just a few days after the winter solstice. So we only have one instance of a John. So what we're trying to say here is that solstices are always births, they're not deaths. Okay, so the Holikin and the Okin mythology being in the summer and winter solstice is not quite right. We're getting close, but the solstice is about births. It's the equinoxes, when light overcomes dark, or when dark overcomes light, when the length of the day is longer than the length of the night. So based on this information, we can look at the story of Lu. Now, Lu has a very interesting way of dying in Welsh mythology. In order to kill Lu, you cannot be killed indoors or outdoors. You can't be killed when it's day or night. You can't be killed when he's neither riding nor walking, nor clothed nor naked, nor by any weapon lawfully made. And so eventually, Blueworth, who fell in love with another character called Gron, and wants to kill Lu and take his lands, they arrange to figure out how Lu can be killed. And she eventually manages to trick the information out of him. And he explains to her that he can be killed by standing with one foot on the edge of a cauldron and one on the back of a goat, on the bank of a river, at dusk, with a small hut with no walls but a thatched roof built over the top of it. And so, through a bit of trickery, Blueworth arranges for this to happen, and Gron spends a year making the spear. The spear can only be made, it's going to be made within 1 year, and it can only be made when the rest of the villagers are at mass. It has to be done on a Sunday morning, only on Sunday morning. And eventually, the whole situation is set up. Gron pops up from behind her, throws the spear, pierces Lu, and Lu turns into an eagle. And the story ends with Gron taking over Lu's lands for a period of time. Gwydion chases the eagle down, finds him in a tree, helps him back to becoming Lu, nursing him back to health, and eventually they take the land back. And to take his land back, Lu arranges for Gron to be stood in exactly the same place that Lu was stood, i.e. on the cauldron, bat, the hut and everything. The only difference is Lu allows Gron to place a big stone in front of himself. Lu, being the spearman that he is, manages to throw the spear right the way through the stone, through Gron, killing Gron, taking back his land. At this point, Gwion comes and has words with Blueworth and eventually changes her into an owl. So, the bardic riddle in all of the story is... Sorry?
That story is kind of similar to the Greek mythology where they have to go, I think it's a giant or something, where he basically gets pulled up into the air to be killed by Mansfield or something in his story. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but it's very similar.
All of the mythologies are very interrelated. So yeah, the bardic riddle to this is, can anyone tell me at what time of year the lion, betrayed by the virgin, stood at the point of balance, becomes an eagle? Any astrologers in the room? Lion, followed by the virgin, stood at the point of balance, and the Scorpio, or an alternative symbol for the Scorpio throughout history, has always been the eagle. So we have, sorry, stood between the cauldron, the cancer of the crown, and on the back of a goat, Capricorn. The point of the summer solstice and the winter solstice, stood at the balance, is the equinox. So the death occurs at the equinox, the point of balance that we talked about before. And there's the stone. It's still there in Wales, on the banks of the river Sinfell. So who are the local gods? Last two slides, I think. I think what we've finally got to is Briganti made Marion Blueworth, the May Queen Maiden, sovereignty mother Winterhand. throughout the year she evolves. Equally, you have Robin, Lugus, or the Holly King, the Red King. He's the summertime upperworld controller or the winter underworld controller. And then we have John, Red Bonus, or the Oak King, the Winter King, the Old King. He's the summer underworld ruler and the winter upperworld ruler. So what we end up with is a cycle of the seasons that looks something like this. The winter solstice at the top, we have the birth of the Summer King. At this point, the Winter King reigns supreme, is at the height of his power. It's a Moot, we have the rejuvenation of the goddess as the Spring Virgin. And then at the Spring Equinox, we have the fight between the two kings, with the Summer King becoming victorious and mating with the goddess. At Beltane, the Winter King ascends to the ruler of the underworld. So he's died at the equinox and he's been now becomes ruler of the underworld, which is why Belenus, Beltane begins to make sense now if you understand him as the old king, because he's the ancestor figure, Belimoir, the ancestor. The summer solstice, the summer king's at the height of his power, and the winter king is born into the upper world. Lunacer is a celebration of the summer king delivering the harvest. He successfully delivered what he said he was going to deliver when he defeated the old king. He was allowed the summer to deliver. The autumn equinox, the battle ensues again, because of course in the story, Lu had to get Gron to stand in exactly the same heat he was between the cauldron and the goat, at the middle point between the two solstices. At Samhain, the Summer King ascends to the underworld to become the underworld ruler, and the goddess becomes the crow, or is converted to the owl if we talk about Blue Red. And so eventually we get back to the winter solstice where the Summer King is reborn again in the upper world as the new sun. And so we have a cycle of myth that fits to our local mythology. It fits and is described in sacred areas all around our local landscape, capturing solar alignments. And I think that largely brings me to the end. So if you liked it all, you're familiar with my website, you can read a lot of what I've put down on nashville.co.uk. I also have another project, which is a calendar project, if you're interested in calendars and those sorts of things. Go to calendar.co.uk. Feel free to have a look. Thank you.
So, where does the terror phrase "you've got monk on"?
Oh God, I forgot all about that, didn't I? In other parts of the country, it's got your hood on. So what it's trying to say is that you've got your hood on, but it's somehow kind of bad. What does that mean? The reason is hood in Welsh, H-U-D, means fairy. So okay, and so what you have is this association between obviously Robin and the fairies and the devil as they become Christian. So to have the monk on your shoulder, to have the hood on your shoulder, is to have the devil in your head, to be angry.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Basically, you're mad, you're angry, you're upset. That's what
Yeah, it's to have the devil in your head. You have your hood on to have your monk on. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot about that. Anything else anybody would like to ask questions on?